All right. Well, welcome everyone. Good morning. I don't have my welcome pitch down like Brian Crimmins does, because normally he's here every Friday morning welcoming the whole world from different time zones. But I'm Nathan Chappell. I'm the Senior Vice President at DonorSearch. Really excited to be in this conversation today. I was sharing with this fine group of panelists this morning just before we got on that we each do a lot of presentations, and this week we had a number of conferences going on, but this session I've been really looking forward to because it's inspiring, educating, organic. I have just tremendous respect for the people that you're going to hear from, and we're going to talk to each other this morning to talk about something that I think is an important topic right now. So we're not here to sell anything. We're not here to pitch anything. Which is super freeing too. So I'm really enjoying that, just being able to get on and have intelligent conversation with some incredible folks. So the title this morning was Defining Philanthropy 2022. You all know that because you signed up for it. It was really prompted by a recent interview between Elon Musk and Chris Anderson, the founder of TED, where essentially Elon Musk, and if you haven't watched this, you should go to TED and watch the whole hour and a half. Really paints a picture of, how soon we're all going to be on Mars, driving our Tesla rocket ships, I guess. But it really came at about 2/3 of the way through that interview where Elon Musk says, where they're talking about philanthropy, it's kind of a sensitive topic, that SpaceX, Tesla, Neuralink, and the Boring Company are philanthropy. If you say philanthropy is love of humanity, they are philanthropy. And so with that, of course, I kind of had to put a little dig on LinkedIn and just say, well, does buying a Tesla make you a philanthropist? And it really opened up in a good way, I think, a can of worms. I don't think I've at least personally had that much reaction so quickly from the LinkedIn community. And it was polarized in a I think in a really good, healthy way. And so I'm going to go through and again, this is not about an Elon Musk. We could probably debate whether Elon Musk is a good person or a philanthropist or a business person all day long, but we're here just to talk about this statement is, essentially the companies like Tesla and Boring Company, are they philanthropy? Is the definition of philanthropy changing? So I'll read a couple of the comments and then we'll do some introductions to the group, and then we're just going to have a lot of fun having a conversation. So I kind of grouped the comments on LinkedIn into different sections. So kind of for this idea that, yes, this is philanthropy has changed. There are comments like Musk is a job creator and wealth creator, moving the needle on big issues that can't be solved by simply writing a big check. Comments like, this is the future of philanthropy. Comments like, philanthropy is a spectrum, has to be viewed as such. And then the last one in the section is, many charities have lost their direction and become more politically motivated than they are publicly motivated. It's kind of an interesting sentiment there. And there were a lot of heated comments that were against this idea that Tesla and the Boring Company could be considered philanthropy. Very pointed comments like, money can't buy a heart. Philanthropy as a field is a complex history and can be a way for companies to cleanse unethical business practices. We've seen that a lot, and I've spent a lot of time working in nonprofit where we had people try to give us money to essentially as penance for either personal or corporate issues. Comments like, if this is the future of philanthropy, we're all in big trouble. A lot of people commented on that, liked it, and even someone wrote amen to the nth degree. And then a lot more comments around kind of this idea that meeting consumer needs and expanding the market for gains is not philanthropy. There's a difference between philanthropy and the private sector, social impact, and other related but significantly distinct behaviors. And then kind of the sum of this was the idea, the more traditional sense of philanthropy. Philanthropy is the love of humankind. It can be enacted through giving of time, treasure, and talent. However, when someone receives benefit from such activities, it's no longer considered philanthropy. And then my favorite one in this kind of bucket was just an emoji face vomiting all by itself. And that was probably the sentiment. But the one that struck me, of all the pros and all the cons, the one that struck me the most was really this comment of, this is an interesting concept and conversation, but why does it even matter? So So really that why does it even matter really struck me. And I thought, man, it does matter whether you are for this idea of philanthropy changing and expanding or not. This conversation absolutely matters. And we know this because, well, not to get too philosophical here, but less people in America are giving less. And, absolutely this conversation really matters. So I'm going to introduce you. I'll do my best to introduce you to our panelists who I'm so honored to know personally and professionally. We're going to start in no particular order. I'm going to start with Sterrin Bird. Sterrin, and I'm going to write what I wrote, so you have to bear with it, Sterrin. She is a woman of many accomplishments. She serves as a senior role at Salesforce as a nonprofit industry advisor. She's a member of the Forbes Nonprofit Council, a member of the Society of Fellows at the Aspen Institute. Her resume reads like a Cheesecake Factory menu. It goes on and on with senior roles like March of Dimes, United Way, Children's Health Council. And she's been a consultant for many years with CCS and with her own consulting firm. And according to one of my staff members this week who met Sterrin at AFP Icon, she's a straight up legit badass. I think that sums it up the best for Sterrin. Tiana, I think I wasn't sure if I was going to say this, but I am going to say this because I'm an extremely proud uncle. Tiana is actually my niece, and she is a remarkable young woman who has done amazing things all through her college experience at UCLA and where she's at now. So Tiana Austel is a senior specialist for CSR at Illumina, just a tiny little biotech company down in San Diego. That's facetious. They're an enormous biotech company that has grown tremendously, do genome sequencing. She is and always has been a volunteer extraordinaire. All of her time through UCLA was volunteering on different committees, and not just volunteering, but serving in leadership roles all throughout the community. She's really passionate about, obviously, CSR programs, DE&I initiatives, especially in the medtech and pharma areas. But what she was telling me recently, which is why I wanted to have her as a millennial looking at philanthropy through a different lens, is during her time at Illumina, and I forgot how many years it's been, Tiana, you can give me a number.
5 years.
5 years. She's seen the program go from a few $100,000 to 14.5 million this year, with a target of 17 million next year, and helping them move their way to a 1% model in the 2030s. So tremendous growth and tremendous effort in worldwide impact with her at Illumina. Margaret, I've had the privilege to know for a few years. She serves as the Associate Vice President of Advancement at Emory University. Prior to Emory, she was AVP at Thomas Jefferson University. She has an MBA from Villanova, a Master's in Psychology from Rosemont College, and is a CFRE. She's experienced, she's wise. The combination of her 2 degrees, we had a great dinner conversation about, really plays a significant role in philanthropy. And really, she's been in the trenches raising money for health sciences for 23 years. So she is a woman that has tremendous experience in the trenches, seeing this from a really impactful lens. And then last but not least, the infamous Brian Crimmins is a global thought leader on corporate purpose. He's a creator of 100. It's the first coalition marketing agencies that came together. It's owned by Omnicom. He's very common or often popular. I don't know, popular, but he is a public speaker. He's sought after. I always have to give him a hard time on fundraising and philanthropy. He's also one of the most connected people I've ever met. When he makes comments like, "When I was with the Pope last week," you know that Brian is legit. And last but not least, Brian is the co-author of The Generosity Crisis, A Case for Radical Connection to Solve the World's Greatest Challenges. Brian is an MBA from St. John's, Peter Tobin College of Business in New York. All right, so did I do okay with all those? All right, it's always fun when you have somebody else interpret your entire life with about 60 seconds. So, all right, so like I said, this conversation is not about Elon, whether he's right or wrong. It's really discuss kind of a divergence in thought practice on whether or not the term philanthropy is changing. There's no, I don't think, right answers here, and I don't think there's any wrong answers here. we're all students in this conversation, and me for sure, really wanting to learn from all of you as we're, kind of navigating this from a lot of different angles. But it really does call the question, is philanthropy, the historical definition of philanthropy, does it still hold true? Has it already changed? Is it changing now? And is it going to be completely different in the future or the same? So for anyone joining here, I do encourage you to add chat or put comments in chat. I don't know that we'll be able to get to them depending on how this goes, but if we think about this conversation and find that it's valuable for people, we may turn this into a series of conversations. So please let us know if you have other things, and we'll do our best to try to weave those in. All right, so we're going to get started here with just kind of the softball question before we get into some of the harder things. But just for the group, and we can kind of go around in your own terms, let's just kind of share how you define philanthropy from your own lens and your own kind of upbringing. How about we start, and again, I didn't think this out. Margaret, you're on my top left, so why don't we just start with you? You got the
Sure. I have a definition of philanthropy. It's in one of our books that we share with our physicians. And I feel like it's a responsibility of mine to understand what it is I'm doing and what I'm asking of people. So my definition is giving of money, time, or other resources that is meant to change the experience of others, bring a sense of control to a situation that feels uncontrollable, bring meaning to loss or suffering, or simply express gratitude. So it really covers, for me, it's about, obviously, a lot about meaning. And for my life, I think the first experiences of philanthropy, I guess that I was aware of, were in church. I think of Lent, where we were all asked to make some kind of sacrifice. But in my life, in terms of receiving philanthropy, I would say the most meaningful that really comes to mind is when I was in grad school as a single mom. Someone rented me an apartment way below market value. And that was an action that really affected my life.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that. It's amazing how those personal, as a giver, but also as a recipient, stick with you. Yeah, that's amazing. Thanks for sharing, Margaret. How about we move over to Tiana? You're on my top right.
So I had my own definition, but I actually like Margaret's a lot more. So I'm going to adopt her definition.
No right
It
or
always
wrong.
happens.
No
Yeah.
right or wrong answers
Yeah.
here.
When you're picking, I was like, I hope I don't go first. Yeah, but I think when I think of philanthropy, it's a lot of like, what is the root feeling behind it? I think of the cause instead of the result. And so sometimes I think of when people think about philanthropy, they think about the end result, the end donation to a nonprofit. But I guess for me, it's really thinking about what was the perspective going into the philanthropy. And so I think actually following up on Margaret's thought about her first experience with philanthropy. My first experience with philanthropy was actually as a young child. My grandfather did international work with the Rotary, specifically with polio. And I remember him coming back and telling me about these stories of philanthropy, about going out into the community, giving your time, talent, and treasure. And that was deeply impactful because I think it made me realize that we live in a community of interconnected folks, and that philanthropy is a two-way street where it is beneficial to not only yourself because you receive warm, fuzzy feelings from the philanthropy, but also thinking about on the other lens, how are you helping support other people that in turn will help support you potentially in the future? So I think that's something that is not really discussed a lot with philanthropy. I think many times philanthropy is seen as a one-way street, but I think it's important to see it still as a complex, nuanced topic about how does philanthropy eventually enter into a cycle instead of just that street.
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing, Tiana. And of course, her grandfather is my father-in-law, who was a worldwide humanitarian in polio, and actually a very large player in getting polio eradicated to where we're at today. And something I reflected on yesterday as I was thinking about this conversation is that at the end of his kind of life, when he was reflecting on all of the actions, he spent 8 months out of the year in places like Rwanda and Ghana and Pakistan and getting mugged, and he'd just get up and go again. And his one reflection that really stuck with me was this idea that action without love is meaningless. And it's the same sentiment as like a Mother Teresa or others, that Gandhi, that would have figured this out later. Just doing something without love was just an action. And so that really, for me, I think ties back to that classic definition of philanthropy, for the love of mankind. So thanks, Tiana. Sterrin, you're up.
So my answer to this question actually is yes, what they said, but really for me, it's really very simple. For me, the very essence of philanthropy, both from a definition and from a practical perspective, is people helping people. And I actually firmly believe that as long as there are people walking this planet, we will help each other and we will find ways to do it. So my overarching theme for this entire conversation is I don't think philanthropy will ever change if that's my definition, because people will always step forward and help each other and meet those moments. I think the nuance around it is about how that happens. And that, I think, is what is functionally changing with things like B Corps or what Mr. Musk is doing, et cetera. But at its core, we are, since we were in caves, we have been tribal, and we take care of each other, and we exist in community with one another. And whether it's technology or just the way our worlds have matured, that have made us pay more attention, particularly in recent decades, to the individual and the rise of the individual. At the end of the day, we need look no further than the last couple of years to realize that no matter how much of an individual you are, we are wholly and completely interdependent on one another. And in order to survive, never mind, and especially if we expect to thrive. So that's really my broad brush stroke on this, is that we will always help each other in some way, shape, or form. We will also do crummy things too. I mean, I'm not going to pretend to be Pollyanna in that regard, but I think at the end of the day that we rise to the occasion to take care of one another. And that's what philanthropy is. And then I would add, I think that the second part of your question was how or where did that manifest in my life personally, and when did I first recognize it? I would say that it actually happened to me at a very young age, because I grew up arguably privileged as a very young child. And then when I was in middle school, my parents, through a series of unfortunate choices and circumstances, lost everything and ended up homeless and eating out of food banks. And in fact, when I was in college, my parents were homeless. So for me, I think I understood early as a child, watching my mom volunteer and give back and in church. And then later, as I grew up and really could internalize and understand what was happening to my family, I saw the community come around them and support my family in a way that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to manage. And so I think for me, and that's how I ended up in this business as it were. It's really it's a vocation for me in terms of how we do this and why we do it. And again, it comes back to me to people will always help each other.
And you saw that firsthand. Thanks for sharing such a intimate and personal story. And that's just, I think so many people can see how, that experience can, give you a life of passion to work, I see you work endlessly for the betterment of humanity. And I think because so much of those experiences, you were able to see that. I do think it's an interesting point. I think something I take for granted, this idea that philanthropy is not about money, but essentially is what you're saying. It's about service, and it's about, action or helping versus a dollar amount. You agree with that?
I do 100%. I think, it's about picking up, I mean, philanthropy is simple as picking up someone's kids from school for them if they need you to help them, all the way through to making $100 million gift to name a children's hospital.
Yeah.
It's everything in between. And that's why the expression time, talent, and treasure exists.
Yeah. I do think for some of us, we take that concept for granted. We those that work professionally in philanthropy, like, of course, it's not about money. A philanthropist is a biased term or stereotype that we add to a person of wealth in society in general. But the average person out there, I think if you were to poll, thinks, philanthropist is someone that gives a lot, and I do think there's a lot of education that, because everything that we've shared so far has really nothing to do with money. I mean, even Margaret's, really defined, or her definition really talked about volunteerism and caring and service. All right, Brian, you're up.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'll just build on where everybody's been. To me, the definition of philanthropy, which you've touched on already, is sort of the love of humanity, the service. That's always been the thing that I've really liked and sort of used as my North Star when I've thought about philanthropy. I think, as you've just started talking about with the exchange with Sterrin, that's the blessing and the curse of the definition, as more ways of doing that are manifesting and becoming clearer, more spoken about. I think that's what's driving a bit of the, coupled with, as you said, Nathan, most people think of a philanthropist and they think ultra high net worth people who can, name buildings and do some other things. But so I love this conversation. It's fascinating as this whole conversation in the sector evolves. But if it true to its heart, I think the love of humanity is what really, for me, when I think of philanthropy, which does it on a very practical level. Being the youngest of 9, we just had parents that modeled this concept of there's a much bigger world than just us. I mean, so we always were doing things in the community and trying to help. And then on a very practical level, if I had known then what I'm about to tell you about what I'd be doing for a living, I probably wouldn't be surprised. But being the youngest of 9, my dad reached a point in his career where he was asked to chair. He also went to St. John's University in New York, and he was asked to chair their first ever capital campaign back in the early 90s now. And I remember vividly him sitting on the couch, sort of talking out loud, being on phone calls about, people giving and what they were giving for, and just being fascinated this concept that people gave money, that they supported St. John's. And I literally had a front row seat, little did I know at the time, to a practical capital campaign leader in my dad. And again, didn't know then what I would know now and do for a living. So there's a personal, professional sort of blending of all that, that when I think back about where I first started understanding all this, it was a really personal, time frame and time that I had with my dad.
So when you were a little child and they had that future fundraiser T-shirt, they took that seriously. Yeah, you've been in training your whole life. Yeah, that's amazing. Well, thank you all for sharing, and I think really grounding this conversation. I want to start out, and this is actually perfect, going back to something that Sterrin had shared. And one is I can't help this, because Sarah and I were on a call a couple of weeks ago, and she said she was in a conversation with, I think, someone at Salesforce who asked the question, is philanthropy dead as we know it? And I thought her response was really insightful. So I want to start there, but I want to follow up, ask her a follow-up to that question. So Sarah, what are your thoughts on that? And did that question even surprise you, or was it rhetorical, or just a conversation?
Well, I mean, I think the gentleman who asked me the question, it was rhetorical. And my response, frankly, was just as I said to all of you a moment ago, is that as long as people are walking the planet, philanthropy will not be dead. I mean, it is, if in fact my definition is my definition and how I see it about people helping people. Do I think that the business of philanthropy is changing? Yes. But do I think the core of what philanthropy is changing? And the answer is no. I don't think we will ever go to a place where we don't lean in and help each other. And so much of people helping people, or peer-to-peer, or all of the nomenclature and all of the buzzword and jargon that we use in this business, all of that will continue to evolve and change as we learn more about how to connect with each other in new ways. Mm-hmm. And that's actually, my positive spin on like a Tesla or whatever else. I mean, it's just a different way of doing that to enable people to connect. So I don't think philanthropy is going away. Do I think the business is changing? Definitely. Do I think we are, when I think about philanthropy and the work that I was doing 25 years ago compared to what the fundraisers are doing today and how they have to do it, there are a lot of things about the way that and the business and the science of it that are different and better and remove friction and make it a little bit easier to leverage support for said missions across the world. But there are also certain tenets that are tried and true and that will never change. And again, it comes back to relationships, people, and enabling. I said something in an AFP session this week that actually resonated with me after it came out of my own mouth. And I kind of extemporaneously said it. One of the things that we do as fundraisers is we have the great privilege and honor to help enable people to do something that they already wanted to do in ways that they might not have actually imagined. And so I don't think if we can keep the people part and the relationships in the center of this, I don't think it will ever change.
Well, good thing we're recording this. That's quotable. I would agree that's a great sentiment to share and to kind of hold on to. So with that said, and this will be, you can answer this and then we're going to move to Tiana to kind of riff off this, but you're talking about people helping people. And part of what inspired this conversation is companies helping people. So what are your thoughts on philanthropy pivoting from people helping people to companies helping people?
Well, I think there isn't a company on the planet that can't actually go through some relative sense of examination of this right now. There's a really interesting article in, I believe it was last month's Harvard Business Review around what's the purpose of your purpose. And it ostensibly, and I will do a terrible job of summarizing this, so bear with me, but ostensibly it invites corporations to take a look at what is it that they are doing around social good, and what is it that they are talking about, how are you talking about that with your employees? And then how are you practically bringing that forward in your business and forward to the communities in which you operate and serve? And the net of it is that purpose-driven business cannot be marketing. It has to actually have rubber hitting the road. And I would say that for my friends that work currently in PR and in communications in big agencies in New York and around the world that are talking about this, is the companies that are coming at this with an authentic perspective and a real heartfelt feeling about wanting to do it. The work of purpose is really quite challenging. I mean, because it has to be multi-threaded through your entire business. And I think if anything, that might be one of the biggest things about philanthropy that is changing, because corporations, and not just, a Salesforce, for example, this has been part of our founding, but I think we are an interesting example for others to follow as they spin up new businesses and re-examine who they are coming out of the pandemic, that it's time now for business, as Mr. Benioff says, to be the greatest platform for change, because it can be, but it has to be purposeful and it has to be multi-threaded, and it cannot just be marketing.
Sterrin, I hate interviewing you because you're like 3 steps ahead of me every time. So here we go. So I think that's fantastic. And I think most people would agree. Business has, not just the power, but the responsibility to support humanity. But that's a huge difference, right? So I'll read this quote. You all know Milton Friedman, but this is just 50 years ago. So not like 300 years ago. Milton Friedman said, there is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits. So I can tell you undeniably, when I got my undergrad degree in business, there was only one rule of business, was to increase shareholder value. That was the metric of success at any cost, at the cost of employees, at the cost of the environment. It's amazing how I guess I'm older now, admitting that, is that, since I went to undergrad, in this is 50 years ago, but I went to undergrad 20 something years ago, and business has fundamentally changed since then, because it was basically like, if you don't remember anything else in undergrad, it's that, success in business is about increasing shareholder value. And Brian and I've had this conversation around, moving from shareholder value to shareholder values. It's been a massive, massive shift. And I would argue that Mark Benioff has been a ringleader and, or a bell ringer in that conversation. So fast forward to today, this idea that you don't have to make a decision between, profit and change. And you literally quoted the quote I was going to ask Tiana here, but I was going to ask her what her take is on that quote. I think business is the greatest platform for change. And then the follow-up to that is that idea, the democratization of philanthropy in business, is it a fad? And we have to ask, because 50 years ago it didn't exist. 20 years ago it really didn't exist. It was Tom's shoes. Is it a fad? Is it just a start? Is it a revolution? Where do we see that?
This is a question I could spend 4 hours debating. And this conversation, I think, is really helping me reframe my perspective on philanthropy. I also a little bit want to challenge. I don't exactly think corporations are doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. Like, I think in this philanthropy conversation, I do want to keep in context of, I think part of the reason people do philanthropy in corporations, they do CSR, is really because of this new belief in the triple bottom line. So this goes actually exactly to what you're talking about, Nathan, but thinking about John Elkington and his belief that it's basically people, profit, and planet. And to be honest, in my personal experience at Illumina, part of the reason we're doing CSR is because, and I actually looked this up last night, we've had a 300% increase in investor inquiries around our ESG, so environmental, social, and governance standards. We've also had 78% increase in customer comments around sustainability from last year's customer surveys to this year. So I do want to ground us in the conversation of, I personally don't think that a corporation's CSR strategy is equivalent to philanthropy. I know I am actually inviting some of my other panelists to challenge me on this and provide their perspective. But when I think about what Sterrin said about people helping people, I don't exactly think that a corporation should be seen as a person helping people, because at the end of the line, these grants that we're giving, the work that we're doing, the volunteerism, we're thinking about talent acquisition. So this next generation, Gen Z, millennials, they care deeply about social impact, climate change, what world are we going to live in? Thinking about, even when I started as a practitioner a few years ago, George Floyd, DEI, those were things that were not particularly discussed in the workplace. But if you go on any CSR forum right now, it is buzzing with people talking about how are you implementing DEI into your working teams, and how are you implementing DEI into your grants. So my perspective is, I do think there are people in corporations that are leading CSR. I think it's an amazing thing that people are not just seeing CSR in a very traditional sense of maybe a fettered campaign that's at the end of the year, employees just donate to one single charity, and then they help distribute to the rest of the community. It is a transformation, as Sterrin said, of employee granting councils. So CSR teams trying to decentralize their funds into more of employees' hands. It is matching programs. So how are corporate foundations matching funds where employees are giving? So I think inside of companies, there is philanthropy happening, but I am interested in and want to challenge kind of my other colleagues, and maybe Brian has a perspective on this, but when that equates to a corporation, I want to make sure that we're being very specific about that. And one thing, but before I pass this on, is I really wanted to comment on how oftentimes philanthropy is seen as very classed because it's seen as a money conversation. I am very inspired in thinking about, with this new definition of philanthropy I think this panel is coming up with, I think it provides an opportunity for people who may not have access to financial funds to also contribute and see themselves in a philanthropist that's empowering themselves to see the world in a new way.
Agreed. I agree with you 100%. I mean, it's employee retention, it's employee engagement, it's the future of the workforce that expects to be engaged in an intentional way and wants to align themselves with an organization that is a reflection of their values.
Yeah. Yeah, extremely well said. Thanks, Tiana, and thanks, Sterrin. Brian and I have spent a lot of time together in the last years. We're working on our book, kind of debating this change. And essentially, we have to admit that corporations are getting something right. Corporations are understanding that on how to connect with people, at least at a surface level, to show the action that they're doing something to make it seem like, they're aligned with their values. So really when this came, this is a quote that Brian shared on a call one day, and I'll just have him riff off of this, and feel free to go back to any of that conversation, Brian. But really, when it comes down to it, this idea that we're, well, first I'll kind of frame this up. If those on this call don't read the Edelman Trust Barometer, they absolutely should, because essentially Edelman Trust Barometer measures trust in corporations, nonprofit, media, and the government. For 20 years, this last year, something happened that had never happened, which essentially is that corporations became more trustworthy than nonprofits, and still less ethical than nonprofits, but more competent, which pushed them into this upper quadrant. And now corporations are seen as more trustworthy. And so if it's not philanthropy, it's something else. It's this idea that corporations have figured out a way to tap in to connecting with people in a way that that they are resonating with, and they want to stay employed there, and they want to work there, and they want to invest there. So Brian, can you talk about this idea? And this is your 100% yours sentiment, is that we're in a competition for connection, and and whether that's a new thing essentially, and maybe even where that's going to be going.
Sure. Yeah, there's been some great comments made, so I'll try to riff off a few things and then pass the baton here. But I do think the connection, the competition for connection, I think is a very real thing. You and I were debating the conversation about whether or not for-profits think of it in that lens, that we're in a competition for people's time, their interests, their money even. We're in a competition for all those things with we've always been, but it's just more prevalent, more knowable now that we're in speaking on behalf of a nonprofit, we're in the competition for all those things with a lot of different actors, as we were talking about earlier, whether it's in our personal life, professional life, the companies we shop with and for, our families, etc. So when you reframe, if you were to do this and you're on this call and you're leading a not-for-profit or in development, it's probably, I would suspect it'd be a bit fascinating to think of the strategies you're doing, and are they connecting? Are they breaking through with supporters? I do want to riff off something that Sterrin and Tiana were talking about, which is when companies are doing their CSR, ESG, sustainability, I could go on and on with all the alphabet soups. When those that are doing it right, they are truly authentic. They're authentic to what the company is about and what they stand for and who they. So, and Nathan, to what you were talking about, companies, the sheer assets, the knowledge, the data, the resources they have, they can do a lot of good when they get focused. But I don't want to call it selfish, but it is often in the realm of the area that they work in. And I, for one, think there's nothing wrong with that, as long as it's authentic and as long as, they're moving the needle. So we're back to that. What is that philanthropy? Is it a not conversation? When I think about the very first question you posed a few minutes ago, is philanthropy dead? My first reaction to you, Nathan, was, God, I hope not. Because if you think about that backdrop of companies, there's going to be an inherent selfishness to what they're going to try to solve for, right? Depending on what type of company they're in. Again, my point of view, there's nothing wrong with that. But you, Nathan, as a somewhat of a historian and just so knowledgeable, when we stop and think about what role philanthropy has played in our history, in addressing areas that companies wouldn't have addressed, government couldn't address, because it just wasn't of concern to them, or they didn't have the resources, or whatever it might be. There's breakthrough after breakthrough, institution after institution that has been established. I mean, the AI, I believe, was even funded some original work by a foundation. Your prior employer, Nathan, has done some amazing work that philanthropy has only made possible for the betterment of all of us, that a company wouldn't have solved for, and government money couldn't have. And that's the thing that I worry about as well, is that answering is philanthropy dead? Behind all that is inherently, I hope not, because philanthropy often goes to the things that nothing else will, and philanthropists are really important at all levels in helping us as a society break through the whole chessboard of challenges we face, not just what's interesting to corporations or foundations.
Yeah, I'd almost reframe the Benninghoff quote a little bit to, I think business is the greatest platform for change, to I think business can be the greatest platform for change, because it isn't always. And it also can be fickle. I think that's where a lot of traditional professionals that work in philanthropy worry that at the end of the day, when there are shareholders, can that desire change, or can the agenda change? Whereas nonprofits essentially have to refile if they're going to change their mission, too much. So
Nathan,
Margaret,
one last thing, if I could just riff about that competition for connection thing. The one thing I've seen firsthand, our corporate brands, for-profit clients do really, really well, particularly over the last 10 or 15 years, is engage their consumers, in their business, in their product development, in decisions that they're making. The voice has become so prevalent, and you and I have had this conversation, debate, etc., as nonprofits are waking up to how to do that and the best way to do that. Margaret, I think back about your comment, even you working with doctors, I mean, having their input in that is something that I think the nonprofit can do, I hope, is on the precipice of really understanding how to do that much better in the next 3 to 5. And I know a lot of it's underway, but I think for the rank and file not-for-profit, there's a lot to be learned from that valuable lesson that corporations have been doing for a while.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Brian. And Margaret, as we're kind of taking all these conversations, I feel like they're all kind of distilling down into this idea. You're definitely the most boots on the ground every day, inspiring a team to keep on trucking, to, fight the fight. If anyone's worked as a professional fundraiser, it is not an easy job. It's a lifestyle. It's 24/7. It's a way of, I've always said it's a way of life, not a job. Do you feel that things are changing at all? Is it getting harder to convince people to support? And we could talk about Emory, or just kind of your general sense and other people that do you feel like it's changing?
I'm kind of with Sterrin. I think people will always help people. I can't say that it's necessarily getting harder, but I do think we need to get better at it. I think a lot of this falls on our side of the fence. What do people expect? I think more people are expecting some real accountability. They're expecting to be able to see the impact. And I think a lot of the conversation, even with Elon Musk, he raises an interesting question, and maybe we should rephrase it about, what have we done to protect the integrity of philanthropy as we're practicing it. But you know what, and maybe it's just the nature of being in my business for as long as I have been. I'm never discouraged. So we just keep going. And again, I have the great pleasure of dealing with people with a generous nature, and maybe that biases me toward a belief that it, no matter what, it will continue.
Do you feel that's the same? So you work in healthcare philanthropy, which I've been able to work in, and it is, I would say, the hardest form of philanthropy, the most nuanced, I guess, maybe not the hardest, the most nuanced, because there's confidentiality and there's different types of diseases, and it requires a lot of EQ to do well. Do you, so you have that ability to connect people at an extremely relational, vulnerable way, in a really kind of sacred way. What about your thoughts on, philanthropy for more commodity type of organizations that tend to be like subscription based? And I think a lot of philanthropy in Europe is already like this. And we see some trends in the US that's becoming just be a member. Does that get confusing, do you think, between how people see a nonprofit versus a corporation when it's a little less personal?
I think they're just different experiences. They're just, they're different experiences. I mean, you're right. On the healthcare side, it's very individual. It's very personal. And that comes through the entire experience. And in many ways, it's lifelong, right?
Right.
You never lose those people. But I think it's just a different experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. And one of the things that we, Brian and I, as we've been huddling over the last year on this book, started looking at as brands that essentially portray themselves, or actually not even just portray themselves, live these values. You like Patagonia, that essentially exist to, save the planet, and will use all their resources. And one of Brian's favorite ice cream brands, Ben and Jerry's, I think his family's only allowed to eat Ben and Jerry's because all of their corporate values have to do with, making a better world, a more equitable world. It will be interesting to watch, and I would just pose this to the group. So I would buy this idea that in say healthcare philanthropy, where it's an intimate, you have the ability to connect people at a visceral level. That is something that's really unique. In higher education, I think you can draw upon lots of experiences that drop emotion, hopefully positive emotion, and keep people, lifelong. Not all philanthropy is the same. And I do think there are a lot of people on this call that work in smaller nonprofits, or nonprofits that can be confused with a Newman's Own or a Ben and Jerry's that are doing things. So do we expect that there'll be more corporations that are talking, not just talking, I guess it's maybe the rise of the B Corp, if you will, because I would say like a Ben and Jerry's, a Newman's Own are essentially like B Corps before B Corps were around. Do we think that this will be a trend that people will find, that corporate entity to, basically make money and essentially act as a nonprofit? And this is open for the group.
I mean, I would just say, having spent my whole life in the nonprofit sector and working with donors, I think one of the larger we could do a whole other session on there shouldn't be shame around making money or giving money away. Like there's so much stigma attached to money, period, in our world, that maybe we could let that go. So I think at least I would like to let it go. I should speak for myself. I do think the B Corp is a fascinating and viable and important way that organizations can hold themselves accountable to their participation in and support of their communities. And really, it's a very, very effective way to examine your business and your mission and your purpose. So I would do nothing but endorse moving forward in that direction. And I think there are several. A girlfriend of mine just took her entire, one of the largest global public relations agencies through the process of becoming a B Corp. Wow. And it was a really challenging process, but she and her team managed to do it. And they are leading the way for PR. And so I don't see any reason why we should be afraid of that or not encourage it.
So would Elon's comment not be as contentious if Tesla was a B Corp?
I think so.
Interesting, right? Because I think it brings up this question: is a B Corp a new definition of philanthropy, or really is it this question that can philanthropy include an exchange of goods or services? And I think at the root level, if we're just saying people helping people, it's an exchange of love or exchange of a hand, but not an exchange for a product or a service. And I think that's probably at the core of what a lot of people wrestle with right now. Because if Tesla was a B Corp, I know a lot of people would have great respect for that, because they would know that there are actually conditions and guardrails put in place to make sure that in all areas that corporation is going to, essentially not do harm, but really, a greater good. What are, again, feel free to go back, anyone could go back to the other thought, but what are your kind of sentiment on whether or not philanthropy can include exchange for something?
So that's a great question, Nathan. I think it goes all stems from what as we've been debating here, what the definition of philanthropy, because there's a lot of elements to the term social impact as well, and how we go about achieving social impact. I, for one, think philanthropy is an element of it, not, but there's other, as we've been discussing, there's other ways to help humanity, help one another, etc. So I think it all, as I said, it all starts from how you're thinking of defining it. I think, going back to your other question, I think we're going to see more and more of the purpose-driven companies, whether it's all the way, as Sterrin just talked about with an example of the B Corp, or with the SEC has been spending a fair amount of time looking at coming out with regulation around some what I would call the teeth behind some of the CSR and ESG commitments that companies are making. So I think as that gets more and more systematized, I, for one, think, though, the audience will take a different view of that. You know what I mean? They'll take a, prove it to me, let me show you, see you're actually doing it, not just because the SEC is now holding you. So I think this is going to continue to be an evolving space, I think, for all involved, which, again, I think, from going back to the traditional definition of philanthropy that we've been talking about, I think that's what clouds the confusion for people a little bit. And I've always said in fundraising, if there's confusion, if there's hesitation, people don't give, or at least
Right.
and so I think with the Margarets of the world on the front line, I mean, their job is to sort of push
Keep
away
it
all
clear.
that confusion, to be clear. Exactly.
Yeah.
Margaret. Yeah.
Yeah, clarity and transparency is key. And I think when companies are sort of transforming in these ways, people will want clarity around what's their platform. There'll be accountability. And there may be ways that nonprofits can learn from how they hold themselves accountable and report, and kind of rise to those standards as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely is, when we, I know when I read the Edelman Trust Barometer this year, and I watched a couple of the press releases, or when they came out with it, it shocked me in a bad way. This idea that corporations were seen as more trustworthy than nonprofits. It just hurt. Like, for those of us that have been in this field. Now, we not to diminish the fact that corporations can and should and do make a tremendous impact in the world, and I think that will continue to increase as long as it's popular. I always have to be that, but I think the missing element, and it's not that nonprofits are less efficient or less competent, because many of them are highly efficient and highly competent, but maybe, to your point, they haven't portrayed that well enough. Publicly, and tied into that, really not just this, it's an open book or there's transparency, but that accountability and, communication. So agree or disagree with that?
I agree. I mean, and I think there's an expectation when you talk about an exchange, the most basic part of that exchange is the accountability, is the impact. And the transparency to be able to show it. And I think we could do a lot to catch up on that.
Yeah, I think one of the big takeaways is that piece for nonprofits to really kind of play in the space. I mean, no doubt that corporations are learning how to tap into people at an intimate, personal level. They're, to Brian's point, using a lot of technology to do that, and it becomes this kind of bi-directional relationship where I don't just buy products, but that corporation knows me. I know them and they know me. And a lot of nonprofits, I think the most painful thing I've ever heard, and anyone who's raised money has heard this before from a donor, sorry, a fire truck going by here, of course, is when a donor has, and maybe, hopefully you've never had this experience, if a donor ever says, why is it the only time I hear from you is when you want money? Am I the only one that's had to deal with that? Okay. It's painful, right? I mean, that really cuts to the core. It's because, truly, if it's about relationship, and corporations portray that they're in this relationship, Patagonia definitely knows how to tap into my soul with the language, don't buy this. Oh, how dare you? I'm going to buy that. How dare you, test my competitiveness? But nonprofits, when they're trying to hit this annual goal, versus the metric of how many people are we going to bring along, are two different things. I think this idea that corporations see the long game, and they're able to use that technology to play the long game a little bit more.
And they have reason to see the long game and play that. Let's not forget. I mean, there is a profit part of the situation, and they're meeting their audience in ways quicker than possibly many nonprofits can.
Yeah, definitely.
I was just going to say that I think it's important. There's an old quote that I will ruin right now from John D. Rockefeller about philanthropy, and that the essence of it is that when we think about engaging people in conversations around giving or around volunteering, that you should ask yourself first, how would you want to be approached to be invited to give, or of time, money, talent, whatever the case may be, and really internalize that, and then let that be your North Star in terms of how you're engaging with that donor or that volunteer. And I have often over my 30-year career gone back to that quote when I feel anxiety around speaking with a donor, or concerned about how it is that I want to portray, a particular need or a particular campaign. And it comes down to, what am I actually doing here? And how is it that I want to invite this person to find out more and then ultimately support it? And if you think about how you want to be approached for that, it takes a lot of the anxiety and aggravation out of it. And it really is a really wonderful equalizer. And I mean, you can look at it starts with giving should be thought of largely as you would think about investing. And if you were investing, what information would you need to have in order to lean forward that? And that is the guiding principle.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's still, while 100 years old, a pretty relevant lesson for a lot of nonprofits to to address, because that is essentially the competition. Tiana, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to add on. First of all, fascinating conversation. I very much enjoyed listening to you all. But what I also was going to add is, I think part of the reason is because we have 2030 goals. We have 2050 goals for our CSR function. We know exactly how much money we're going to get year over year. And something I see with a lot of nonprofits is you spend the majority of your time fundraising. It's very hard to think in the long term because there isn't that comfort and that stability. So this is a whole nother can of worms, but we're talking about the future of philanthropy, but there's really the future of nonprofits and the future of corporations. They're two entirely separate dragons, in my opinion. And thinking about, even when we talk about CSR, I think that we just have a little more comfort to be funding innovative projects. Like with nonprofits, when we think about capacity building, I think about all the time. Sometimes a nonprofit is trying to apply for a corporate foundation and they want the hot new sexy project that they can put as a flashy newsline, but sometimes they just need a car. Sometimes they just need some of that capacity building, but nonprofits are held to the standard where many of their coordinators need to be on food stamps. Like, just thinking about the way that I think the general public sees how a nonprofit should be, like what is going to be the future of a nonprofit? Like, is it social enterprises? So thinking about, is there a way that we can ensure that a nonprofit is able to have that long-term view instead of always thinking about the next capital campaign, the next money that they get? And I think that's going to take a lot of education for the public. So that's a whole other can of words, is the future of philanthropy, because there's so many different nuances. I feel like it comes to the conversation. And also when we're talking about CSR, there are very innovative companies, but then there's also the very traditional companies that are not, they're not Patagonia. And so it's, I mean, as with everything, it's nuanced.
Yeah. No, and I think as we tie up here, there are so many other questions that I have that it leads me to this idea that this is a conversation that should definitely continue. And of course, we bring our own biases into this from our own lenses. And as I try to step out of that, I think of the average person out there that has never donated, and what are their perceptions of philanthropy versus a corporation that like a Ben and Jerry's or a Newman's Own. And it's like, do they feel like they're making a donation? And I think it'd actually be worthy of a survey to go out there, and I'm sure there's lots of them, but we could even take a swing at this, come back and even kind of dissect some of those results. The one thing that we haven't talked about, which I know tee up for another call perhaps, is really kind of the changing nature of how the vehicle in which people give as well. So we talked about, B Corp's doing good and corporations, CSR programs, But what about, you know, the $17 billion in crowdfunding that's not tax deductible? People helping people, but in non-traditional ways, right? Or non-tax deductible ways, so the ways that most nonprofits would prefer. It's just a massive change that we've seen. And I would say that that idea of going back to the very beginning, I'm hopeful also that philanthropy is alive, that as long as we're here, you know, there's an innate desire, hopefully, to help others along the journey. At least a lot of us are inclined that way. But maybe the vehicle in which that happens is evolving a bit. So I can't thank you all enough for ending this Friday with an awesome conversation. I've been inspired and educated. I am in awe of all of you and all of the hard work that you do to make the world a better place. And it truly is individuals like you that give me hope for humanity, because you represent a lot of other people that feel the same way. So thank you. Thanks for everyone for joining. Please stay in contact with us through LinkedIn at the very least. And we'd love to be able to stay in conversation with you. So have a great Friday. Have a great weekend. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you.